The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt parking lot of Pinewood Elementary School as Maria Santos stepped off the county bus at exactly 2:47 p.m. Her worn military-style backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, and the sleeves of her faded denim jacket were rolled up just enough to reveal the intricate web of burn scars that traced along her forearms like a roadmap of pain. She walked with a slight limp, favoring her left leg, but her posture remained straight and purposeful as she approached the designated parent pickup zone. "Oh, look, the charity case is back." Rebecca Morrison's voice cut through the warm afternoon air like a blade. She stood beside her gleaming white BMW X7, designer sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose, surrounded by her usual entourage of perfectly coiffed suburban mothers. Jennifer Walsh snickered behind her manicured hand while Caroline Drake openly stared at Maria's scarred arms with undisguised disgust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria heard every word but kept walking. She'd learned long ago that responding only gave them more ammunition. Instead, she found her usual spot near the chain-link fence, away from the cluster of luxury vehicles and designer handbags. The metal was warm against her back as she leaned against it, checking her phone for the time. Diego would be out in exactly 8 minutes. "I mean, seriously," Rebecca continued, her voice deliberately loud enough for Maria to hear. "What kind of mother shows up looking like she crawled out of a dumpster? Those scars are absolutely revolting. I don't want my Madison exposed to that kind of trauma." Ashley Kim had her phone out, as usual, pretending to scroll through social media while actually recording everything. She'd started a private Instagram account called Pinewood Pickup Drama, where she posted videos and photos of what she called questionable parenting choices. Maria's scarred arms had been featured more than once. The automatic doors of the school whooshed open, and children began streaming out in colorful waves of backpacks and laughter. Maria straightened up, her eyes scanning the crowd for Diego's familiar mop of dark hair and his favorite red Spider-Man backpack. When she spotted him, her entire demeanor softened, and a genuine smile spread across her face for the first time that day. "Mama!" Diego called out, weaving through the crowd of parents and children with the agility of a 9-year-old. He crashed into her arms with the kind of enthusiasm that made her forget, for just a moment, about the stares and whispers. "Hey there, mijo," Maria said, smoothing down his unruly hair. "How was school today?" "Good!" "We learned about fractions in math, and Mr. Thompson said my essay about heroes was really good. He wants to read it to the class tomorrow." Diego's eyes sparkled with pride, and Maria felt her heart swell. "That's wonderful, baby. I can't wait to hear all about it." She helped him adjust his backpack straps and was about to guide him toward the bus stop when Rebecca's voice pierced the air again. "Madison, honey, stay close to Mommy. We don't want you catching anything from the scary lady." Rebecca's voice dripped with false sweetness, but her words were clearly intended to humiliate. Diego's small body tensed against Maria's side. At 9 years old, he was old enough to understand when someone was being cruel to his mother, even if he didn't fully grasp why. His hands clenched into tiny fists, and Maria could see the confusion and anger building in his dark eyes. "Mama, why does that lady always say mean things about you?" Diego whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and indignation. Before Maria could answer, Jennifer Walsh chimed in with a theatrical gasp. "Oh my goodness, Rebecca, look at her arms. What happened to her? Was she in some kind of accident? Or maybe—" She paused dramatically, lowering her voice just enough to seem conspiratorial while ensuring everyone could still hear. "Maybe it was drugs. You know how these people are." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd endured months of subtle jabs and pointed looks, but this was different. This was a direct attack on her character, and worse, it was happening in front of Diego. She could feel her son's small body trembling with rage beside her, and she knew she had to do something before he exploded. "Diego," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people say hurtful things because they don't understand. It doesn't make it right, but it's not about us. It's about them." But 9-year-old Diego Santos had heard enough. His mother had taught him about respect, about standing up for what was right, and about protecting the people you love. He pulled away from Maria's protective embrace and marched straight toward Rebecca Morrison with the fearless determination of a child who'd inherited his mother's warrior spirit. "You need to stop being mean to my mama," Diego said, his voice clear and strong despite his small stature. He planted himself directly in front of Rebecca's designer-clad frame, his chin raised defiantly. "She's a good person, and she takes care of me, and you don't know anything about her." The entire pickup area seemed to fall silent. Parents stopped their conversations mid-sentence. Children paused their games. Even the crossing guard turned to watch the unfolding drama. Rebecca Morrison looked down at this small boy with a mixture of shock and amusement, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. "Well, isn't that precious?" Rebecca said with a condescending smile. "The little boy thinks he needs to protect his damaged mommy. How sad." She looked around at her friends for support, and they obliged with knowing nods and barely suppressed laughter. Maria felt something crack inside her chest. She could handle the insults directed at her, but watching her son try to defend her honor while being mocked by grown women was more than she could bear. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to intervene, but she also felt a fierce pride in Diego's courage. He was standing up for what was right, just like she'd taught him. "My mama isn't damaged," Diego said, his voice growing stronger. "She has scars because she's a hero. She was a soldier, and she saved people. You're just a mean lady who makes other people feel bad because you're not happy." The wisdom in those words, spoken with the brutal honesty that only children possess, seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Rebecca's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger that crept up her neck, and her smile became sharp and dangerous. "A soldier?" Caroline Drake laughed openly. "Oh, that's rich. What was she, a cook? A secretary? Because she certainly doesn't look like any soldier I've ever seen." Ashley, Kim's phone, was recording everything now, barely concealing her excitement at the drama unfolding in front of her lens. This would definitely be her most viewed post yet. Maria stepped forward and gently placed her hands on Diego's shoulders, pulling him back against her. "That's enough, Mijo. We need to go catch our bus." But Rebecca wasn't finished. Something about Maria's quiet dignity seemed to infuriate her even more than Diego's defiance had. "You know what I think?" she said, her voice taking on a cruel edge. "I think you're just another damaged veteran looking for sympathy. Playing the hero card to excuse your obvious problems. I mean, look at you." She gestured dismissively at Maria's thrift store clothes and visible scars. "Is this really the kind of role model you want around our children?" The words echoed across the pickup area, and Maria felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. Some parents looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly and avoiding eye contact. Others seemed to be waiting for her response with barely concealed curiosity. A few nodded in agreement with Rebecca's assessment. Maria Santos had faced enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan. She'd pulled wounded comrades from burning vehicles under sniper fire. She'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers under her command. But standing in that suburban school parking lot, surrounded by judgment and cruelty, she felt more vulnerable than she ever had in a war zone. "Mama," Diego whispered, his small hand finding hers. "Are you okay?" Maria Santos had never intended to become the target of Pinewood Elementary's most vicious gossip circle. 6 months ago, when she'd enrolled Diego at the school after moving to Riverside County, she'd hoped for a fresh start. A place where her past wouldn't define her present, where Diego could make friends and feel normal, where the ghosts of Afghanistan might finally fade into the background of their new civilian life. The apartment in Valley Vista wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, thin walls, and a persistent leak in the bathroom ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix, but it was theirs. Maria had painted Diego's room bright blue and let him choose superhero posters for the walls. She'd found a second-hand dining table and chairs that didn't match, but were sturdy enough for homework and art projects. Most importantly, it was walking distance to Diego's school and close to the bus line that took her to her job at Sunrise Diner. Working the morning shift at the diner meant she could be home when Diego got out of school, but it also meant getting up at 4 a.m. to prep for the breakfast rush. Her manager, Pete, was understanding about her medical appointments at the VA and never complained when her hands shook too badly to carry full coffee pots on the rough days. The tips weren't great, but combined with her disability payments, it was enough to keep them fed and housed. The scars on Maria's arms told a story she rarely shared with anyone. Third-degree burns from a vehicle explosion that had claimed 2 members of her unit and left her with months of skin grafts and physical therapy. The doctors had done their best, but the raised, twisted tissue would always mark her as someone who'd been through trauma. In Afghanistan, those scars had been badges of honor, proof that she'd survived when others hadn't. In suburban California, they seemed to mark her as something to be feared or pitied. Diego had never known his father. Maria had been 3 months pregnant when she'd deployed for her second tour, and, by the time she'd returned, the relationship had dissolved into angry texts and unreturned phone calls. She'd raised Diego alone from the beginning, and he'd never questioned why their family looked different from others. To him, it was normal to have a mama who sometimes woke up screaming from nightmares, who counted exits in every room they entered, who kept a go-bag packed by the front door just in case. The problems at school pickup had started gradually. At first, it was just curious stares and whispered conversations that stopped when Maria approached. Then came the subtle exclusions. Invitations to birthday parties that never materialized, playdate requests that were politely declined, a general social isolation that left Diego wondering why other kids' moms didn't want to talk to his mama. Rebecca Morrison had emerged as the unofficial leader of the parent social hierarchy at Pinewood Elementary. Her husband was some kind of investment banker, and she treated the school like her personal kingdom. She organized fundraisers and bake sales with military precision, coordinated class parties that could have passed for magazine spreads, and somehow always managed to make other parents feel inadequate by comparison. Jennifer Walsh served as Rebecca's loyal lieutenant, always ready, with a supportive nod or a perfectly timed gasp of outrage. Her daughter and Rebecca's daughter were best friends, which had cemented their mother's alliance years ago. Caroline Drake rounded out the trio, newer to the group but eager to prove her worth through increasingly cruel observations about other parents. They'd started with subtle jabs about Maria's appearance, comments about how some people didn't seem to understand appropriate pickup attire, observations about how certain parents didn't seem to prioritize their children's social development. Whispered speculation of preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story about Maria's living situation, her job, her obvious status as a single mother struggling to make ends meet. Ashley Kim was the wild card. At 28, she was younger than the core group and desperately wanted to be accepted by them. She'd started her Instagram account as a way to document the social dynamics of school pickup, but it had quickly devolved into a platform for public shaming disguised as entertainment. Her followers loved the drama, and she'd discovered that posts featuring Maria's concerning behavior or inappropriate appearance generated the most engagement. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that she'd fought for the freedom of people like Rebecca Morrison to live their privileged lives in safety, only to have that same privilege weaponized against her and her son. But she'd also learned in the army that not every battle was worth fighting. Sometimes strategic retreat was the wisest course of action. Diego, however, had inherited his mother's protective instincts, along with her dark eyes and stubborn chin. At 9 years old, he was already showing signs of the leadership qualities that had made Maria such an effective sergeant. He noticed everything: which kids were being left out at recess, which teachers seemed overwhelmed, which parents were struggling. He'd started sitting with the lonely kids at lunch and offering to share his snacks with anyone who seemed hungry. Mr. Thompson, Diego's fourth-grade teacher, had noticed the boy's natural empathy and leadership potential. He'd started giving Diego small responsibilities in the classroom, helping struggling students with math problems, organizing supplies, mediating disputes between classmates. In his comments on Diego's report card, he'd written, "Diego shows remarkable emotional intelligence and a strong sense of justice. He has natural leadership abilities that, with proper nurturing, could take him far in life." Maria had read those comments with fierce pride mixed with worry. She wanted Diego to maintain his sense of justice and his willingness to stand up for others, but she also knew how cruel the world could be to people who were different, who didn't fit the expected mold. She'd tried to teach him when to fight and when to walk away, but she was learning that 9-year-old boys had their own ideas about honor and protection. The morning of the confrontation had started like any other. Maria had worked the breakfast shift at Sunrise Diner, serving coffee and eggs to construction workers and early commuters. A regular customer, an elderly man named Frank who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, had left her a $5 tip on a $3 coffee, along with a note that said, "Thank you for your service." He was a Vietnam veteran who'd recognized something in Maria's bearing, and their brief conversations about the weather and local news had become a bright spot in her week. After work, Maria had stopped at the dollar store to buy supplies for Diego's upcoming science project. The assignment was to build a bridge out of popsicle sticks, and she'd been helping him design and test different structures at their kitchen table. Diego approached the project with the same methodical intensity his mother brought to everything, and Maria loved watching his mind work through the engineering challenges. She'd arrived at school pickup 15 minutes early, as usual, finding her spot by the fence and settling in to wait. The early arrival gave her time to decompress from work and prepare mentally for the brief social gauntlet of pickup time. She'd learned to tune out most of the whispered comments and pointed stares, focusing instead on watching for Diego's bright red backpack among the sea of children. But today felt different from the moment Rebecca Morrison arrived. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that made Maria's combat instincts prickle with unease. Rebecca's group seemed more animated than usual, and their glances in Maria's direction carried a weight of malicious intent that hadn't been there before. Maria didn't know that Ashley Kim had posted a particularly vicious video the night before, featuring slow-motion footage of Maria's scarred arms with a caption that read, "When you don't know your pickup lane neighbor's full story, but the evidence speaks for itself." Yikes. The post had generated dozens of comments speculating about everything from drug addiction to domestic violence, each theory more hurtful than the last. She also didn't know that Rebecca Morrison had screenshotted the video and shared it in the private parent WhatsApp group with the message, "Ladies, I think we need to have a serious conversation about the kind of influences we're allowing around our children. Some situations require intervention." The response had been swift and damning. Parents who had never spoken to Maria felt qualified to judge her fitness as a mother based on 30 seconds of secretly recorded video. Plans were made to approach the school administration. Suggestions were offered about how to document, quote, "concerning behavior" for future reference. The digital mob had formed and sharpened its pitchforks while Maria slept peacefully in her small apartment, unaware that her world was about to explode. When Diego emerged from the school building that afternoon, his usual bright smile faltered as he noticed the tension crackling through the pickup area. He was a perceptive child who'd learned to read the emotional temperature of any room, a skill developed from living with a mother who sometimes struggled with crowds and loud noises. He could see the way other parents were looking at his mama, and something in their expressions made his stomach twist with protective fury. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Pinewood Elementary had witnessed in its 40-year history. But as Maria stood there, holding her son's small hand while being publicly humiliated by women who knew nothing about sacrifice or service, she had no idea that help was already on the way. Because earlier that morning, while serving coffee to construction workers, she'd done something that would change everything. She'd finally made a phone call she'd been putting off for months. Tank? She'd whispered into her phone during her break, using the nickname that had followed Sergeant First Class James Williams, from boot camp to Afghanistan and back home again. It's Santos. I think I might need my squad. The phone call Maria had made that morning had been years in the making. She'd carried Tank's number in her contacts since the day she'd been discharged from the hospital, but pride and stubborn independence had kept her from dialing it. Staff Sergeant James Williams had made her promise to reach out if she ever needed anything, but Maria Santos had never been the type to ask for help. In Afghanistan, she'd been the one others turned to when their equipment failed or their spirits broke. She'd been the problem solver, the steady presence who could jury-rig a radio from spare parts or talk a panicked soldier through a mental breakdown over crackling comms. Tank had earned his nickname not from his size, though at 6'4" and built like a linebacker, he certainly fit the description. He'd gotten the moniker from his ability to push through any obstacle, to keep moving forward no matter what tried to stop him. As their platoon sergeant, he'd been the kind of leader who led from the front, who never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When Maria's transport had hit the IED that left her with burns covering 30% of her body, Tank had been the one who'd carried her to the medevac helicopter, his uniform soaked with her blood, whispering promises that he'd never forgotten. The call had lasted less than 3 minutes. Maria's voice had been steady as she'd explained the situation at Diego's school, the escalating harassment, the way it was affecting her son. She hadn't asked for Tank to come. She'd simply said she needed advice on how to handle civilian bullies who seemed immune to reason or basic human decency. Tank had listened without interrupting, and when she'd finished, there had been a long pause before he'd spoken. "Santos," Tank had said, his voice carrying the same authority it had when he'd given orders in the Hindu Kush. "You've been carrying this load alone for too long. Time to remember you've got a platoon." Before Maria could protest, Tank had already moved into planning mode. "I'll make some calls. Doc's in San Diego now, works at the VA there. Wheels is up in Sacramento, doing something with computers. Bear's still active duty, but he's stateside. Phoenix finished her engineering degree last year, working construction in Phoenix, go figure. We can have boots on ground by tomorrow afternoon." Maria had tried to object, to explain that she didn't want to make a big scene or cause trouble, but Tank had cut her off with the kind of gentle firmness that had made him such an effective leader. "Maria, you spent 2 tours keeping us alive. You rebuilt our comm equipment under enemy fire more times than I can count. When that IED went off, you were trying to fix the radio that would have called in air support that might have saved Rodriguez and Kim. You think we're going to let some suburban soccer moms disrespect our mechanic?" The weight of those words had hit Maria harder than she'd expected. Rodriguez and Kim. She still dreamed about them sometimes, still woke up in cold sweats wondering if she could have worked faster, been better, somehow prevented their deaths. Tank had never blamed her for what happened that day, but Maria had carried the guilt, like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove. Now, standing in the Pinewood Elementary pickup area, with Diego's small hand trembling in hers, and Rebecca Morrison's cruel words echoing in the afternoon air, Maria realized that Tank had been right about more than just needing support. She'd been carrying too much alone for too long, and it was time to stop hiding from the truth of who she'd been and what she'd sacrificed. Rebecca Morrison had no idea that her casual cruelty was about to collide with forces far beyond her understanding. To her, Maria Santos was just another damaged veteran to be mocked and marginalized, another reminder of unpleasant realities that didn't belong in her carefully curated suburban paradise. Rebecca's world was one of controlled perfection, where problems could be solved with the right connections and enough money, where appearances mattered more than substance. Jennifer Walsh sensed the shift in atmosphere before Rebecca did. There was something in Maria's posture, a straightening of her spine and a squaring of her shoulders that suggested the quiet woman by the fence was done being quiet. Jennifer had grown up with 2 older brothers who'd served in the military, and she recognized the look of someone who'd reached their limit. But she was too invested in her social standing to break ranks with Rebecca now. Caroline Drake was busy scrolling through her phone, reading the comments on Ashley Kim's latest Instagram post. The video from the night before had exploded across social media, generating hundreds of comments and shares. Some were supportive of the mockery, calling Maria everything from a welfare queen to a dangerous influence. But others were pushing back, pointing out that making fun of someone's scars was cruel regardless of how they'd gotten them. A few commenters had even suggested that the scars looked like burn injuries from military service, but those voices were being drowned out by the chorus of judgment. Ashley Kim had her phone positioned to capture what she hoped would be the climactic moment of confrontation. Her follower count had jumped by 300 overnight, and she was already planning her next post. She'd been contacted by a gossip blog that specialized in Real Housewives of Suburbia content, and they were interested in licensing her content for a feature about pickup line drama. The potential for viral fame was intoxicating, and Ashley was determined to document every moment of Maria's humiliation. But Diego Santos had inherited more than just his mother's dark eyes and protective instincts. He'd also absorbed lessons about honor and integrity that went deeper than most adults understood. At 9 years old, he might not have grasped the full complexity of what his mother had endured in Afghanistan, but he understood that she was a good person who deserved respect. He understood that bullies needed to be confronted, and he understood that sometimes you had to fight for what was right, even when you were scared. "My mama saved people," Diego said, his voice carrying across the pickup area with startling clarity. "She fixed helicopters and radios so soldiers could call for help. She has scars because she got hurt helping other people. What have you ever done that was brave?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca Morrison found herself momentarily speechless, not because she was impressed by Diego's defiance, but because she was genuinely surprised that a child would dare to question an adult so directly. In her world, children were seen and not heard, especially children from families like Diego's. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Rebecca finally managed, her voice shaking with indignation. "Where are your manners? This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what happens when children aren't raised properly." Several other parents had stopped their conversations to watch the unfolding drama. Some looked uncomfortable with the public confrontation, but others seemed entertained by the spectacle. A few were recording with their phones, adding to Ashley Kim's documentation of the scene. Maria felt her chest tighten with a familiar sensation, the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones, but made peaceful civilian life feel like walking through a minefield. Her hands began to shake slightly, a tremor that started in her fingertips and threatened to spread up her arms. She recognized the early signs of what her therapist at the VA called an activation response, the body's preparation for fight or flight when faced with perceived threats. But Diego's brave words had also triggered something else in Maria, something she'd buried under years of trying to blend in and avoid conflict. Pride. Her son was defending her honor, with the kind of courage she'd once seen in soldiers facing impossible odds. He was standing up for what was right, just like she'd taught him, just like her own sergeants had taught her years ago. "Diego," Maria said softly, placing both hands on her son's shoulders. "Thank you for defending me. But we don't need to convince anyone of our worth. We know who we are." She looked directly at Rebecca Morrison for the first time, and something in her gaze made Rebecca take an unconscious step backward. It wasn't anger or hostility, but rather the steady, measuring look of someone who'd faced real threats and found these suburban games lacking in comparison. "Mrs. Morrison," Maria said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority that hadn't been there before. "I've tried to be respectful and stay out of your way, but my son doesn't deserve to watch his mother be humiliated for entertainment." Rebecca's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered beneath her social status. "Entertainment? I'm trying to protect our children from inappropriate influences. Look at yourself. Look at your condition. Is this really the image you want to project?" "My condition?" Maria repeated, and for the first time there was heat in her voice. "You mean the scars I got serving my country? The injuries I sustained protecting the freedom that allows you to stand here and spew hatred without consequences?" The admission sent a ripple of shock through the assembled parents. Several people pulled out their phones to record, sensing that something significant was happening. Ashley Kim zoomed in on Maria's scars, already imagining the dramatic reveal she could craft in her next post. Jennifer Walsh felt a flicker of unease. Her brothers had both served multiple deployments, and she knew that burn scars like Maria's didn't come from accidents or drug use. They came from explosions, from burning vehicles, from the kind of trauma that left invisible wounds as well as visible ones. But she was too deep into the confrontation to back down now. "Oh, please," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Everyone claims military service these days. It's a convenient excuse for all kinds of behavior." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd heard similar sentiments before. The casual dismissal of veteran experiences by people who'd never sacrificed anything more significant than their morning latte. But hearing it in front of Diego, seeing her son's face crumple with confusion and hurt, finally pushed Maria past her breaking point. "An excuse?" Maria's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath now. "Is that what you think this is?" She slowly rolled up the sleeves of her denim jacket, revealing the full extent of the burn scars that covered her arms. The twisted, raised tissue told a story of pain and healing, of skin grafts and months of rehabilitation. In the afternoon sunlight, the scars seemed to gleam with their own pale fire. "These scars are from a vehicle-borne IED that exploded while I was trying to repair a communications array that would have saved 2 of my soldiers' lives," Maria said, her voice carrying across the pickup area like a confession. "I spent 4 months in a burn unit learning to use my hands again. I've had 16 surgeries to repair the damage. And every single day, I wake up knowing that Rodriguez and Kim didn't make it home because I wasn't fast enough." The silence that followed was deafening. Parents who had been filming suddenly felt uncomfortable with their phones raised. Children who had been playing nearby stopped their games to stare at the adults acting strangely. Even Ashley Kim lowered her phone slightly, suddenly uncertain about the entertainment value of what she was documenting. Diego pressed closer to his mother's side, his small hand finding her scarred arm and holding it protectively. He'd heard fragments of this story before, but never the full truth, never the names of the soldiers who died. The weight of his mother's sacrifice settled on his young shoulders, like a mantle he wasn't quite ready to carry, but would anyway. Rebecca Morrison stood frozen, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock and dawning realization on her face. She'd expected Maria to back down, to retreat in the face of public humiliation. She hadn't expected this quiet dignity, this unflinching honesty about sacrifice and loss. But Rebecca had built her social status on never backing down, never admitting error, never showing weakness in front of her followers. Instead of apologizing or retreating, she doubled down on her attack. "Well," Rebecca said, her voice shaking slightly, "that's a very convenient story, but it doesn't change the fact that you're clearly struggling with issues. PTSD, probably. Is that really what we want around our children? Someone who could snap at any moment?" The cruelty of the words hit Maria like shrapnel. She'd been called many things since returning from Afghanistan, but having her trauma weaponized against her in front of her son felt like a violation of everything she'd fought for. Diego's small body went rigid with rage. At 9 years old, he didn't fully understand PTSD or military trauma, but he understood that this woman was using his mama's pain against her. He understood that this was wrong in a way that went beyond simple meanness. "You're a bad person," Diego said, his voice shaking with emotion. "My mama has nightmares sometimes, but she still takes care of me and goes to work and helps people. You just hurt people for fun. That makes you the scary one." Several parents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few began to recognize that they were witnessing something cruel and unjustified. But the social dynamics that had allowed Rebecca to reign unchallenged for so long were still in place, and most chose to remain silent observers rather than risk becoming targets themselves. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded a panic attack. The combination of public confrontation, Diego's distress, and the casual cruelty being directed at her mental health was triggering responses she'd worked years to control. Her hands were shaking visibly now, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool afternoon air. But just as the walls seemed to be closing in, Maria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down and saw Tank's name on the screen. The message was short but clear. ETA 15 minutes. Hold the line, Santos. Something inside Maria's chest loosened. She wasn't alone anymore. Help was coming, and not just any help. Her platoon was coming. The soldiers who'd fought beside her, who'd bled with her, who understood the weight of the sacrifice Rebecca Morrison was mocking. They were coming to stand with her, and for the first time in months, Maria Santos allowed herself to smile. Rebecca noticed the change immediately. There was something in Maria's expression that made her uneasy, a confidence that hadn't been there moments before. "What's so funny?" Rebecca demanded. Maria looked at her phone again, then at Diego, then finally at Rebecca Morrison. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "Nothing's funny," Maria said, "but you might want to be careful what you say about veterans in the next few minutes. You never know who might be listening." The sound of engines in the distance was barely audible over the chatter of parents and children, but Maria's trained ear picked it up immediately. 3 vehicles, moving in formation, approaching from the east. She'd spent enough time in convoy operations to recognize the disciplined spacing and deliberate pace of military drivers, even in civilian traffic. Tank hadn't been kidding when he'd said 15 minutes. Rebecca Morrison was still holding court, her voice rising, as she sensed that somehow the dynamic was shifting away from her control. She'd built a reputation on being the undisputed queen of Pinewood Elementary's social hierarchy, and Maria's unexpected composure was threatening that carefully constructed authority. "I think we should call the principal," Rebecca announced to her gathered supporters. "This woman is clearly unstable, and I don't feel safe having her around our children." "Jennifer, didn't you say your cousin works for Child Protective Services? Maybe we should document this incident." Jennifer Walsh nodded eagerly, already pulling up contacts on her phone. She'd been waiting for an opportunity to prove her loyalty to Rebecca's inner circle, and this seemed like the perfect chance. "I can definitely make some calls. Susan owes me a favor, and she'd be very interested in a case involving a potentially dangerous veteran with obvious mental health issues." Caroline Drake had her own phone out, scrolling through the comments on Ashley Kim's Instagram posts. "The internet is going crazy over this," she reported with barely concealed glee. "People are saying she looks like a drug addict, that those scars are probably from meth lab explosions." One person shared an article about veterans who become violent after deployment. Ashley Kim was in full documentation mode now, her phone capturing every angle of the confrontation. She'd started a live stream that was already attracting hundreds of viewers, and the comments were pouring in faster than she could read them. The potential for viral fame was intoxicating, and she was determined not to miss a single moment of what she was certain would be Maria's complete breakdown. But Diego Santos was watching his mother with the intense focus that had always characterized his relationship with her. At 9 years old, he'd learned to read her moods and responses with an accuracy that would have impressed trained psychologists. He could tell when she was having a bad day before she'd fully awakened. He could sense when she needed space and when she needed connection. And right now, he could see something in her posture that he'd never witnessed before. His mama wasn't breaking down. She was standing taller. There was a stillness about her that reminded him of the way she looked when she was concentrating on fixing something complicated, when her hands moved with precision, and her mind calculated angles and possibilities with mechanical certainty. She was waiting for something, and Diego had inherited enough of her strategic thinking to understand that whatever she was waiting for was going to change everything. The first vehicle to arrive was a black Ford F-150 with tinted windows and a military bearing that was unmistakable even in civilian clothes. It pulled into the parking lot with the kind of precision that spoke of thousands of hours behind the wheel in hostile territory, and when the driver's door opened, Staff Sergeant James Williams emerged like a force of nature contained in human form. Tank hadn't changed much in the 2 years since Maria had last seen him. He was still built like a linebacker, still carried himself with the confident authority of someone who'd led soldiers through impossible situations and brought them home alive. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the military bearing that had been burned into his DNA through years of service, and his eyes swept the pickup area with the systematic assessment of someone trained to identify threats and assets in seconds. Behind him, a silver Honda Accord pulled up with equal precision. The woman who stepped out was smaller in stature but no less impressive in presence. Corporal Lisa Martinez, known to her unit as Doc, moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd spent years saving lives under pressure. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that suggested she'd come directly from her shift at the San Diego VA Medical Center. The third vehicle was a blue Toyota Camry that looked unremarkable until its occupants emerged. Private First Class Michael Chen, called Wheels for his ability to keep any vehicle running under impossible conditions, had the lean build of a distance runner and the alert eyes of someone who'd spent tours monitoring radio communications. Beside him, Staff Sergeant David Johnson, universally known as Bear, was a mountain of a man whose gentle demeanor in civilian life masked the fact that he'd been one of the most effective heavy weapons specialists in their battalion. The fourth member of their group arrived separately, having driven through the night from Phoenix. Specialist Amanda Taylor, known as Phoenix for her ability to rebuild anything that had been destroyed, looked exactly like what she was, a successful structural engineer who'd translated her military experience into a thriving civilian career. She wore a hard hat tucked under one arm and work boots that had seen real construction sites, and her presence added a professional authority to the group that even Rebecca Morrison couldn't ignore. Tank spotted Maria immediately, his gaze taking in the situation with the rapid assessment that had made him such an effective platoon leader. He could see the defensive posture of the parents arrayed against her, the way Diego was pressed protectively against his mother's side, the barely concealed hostility radiating from the group of women who'd clearly been leading the attack. He'd seen similar dynamics in forward operating bases, where local contractors had been harassed by personnel who didn't understand their value to the mission. "Santos," Tank called out as he approached, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection mixed with military authority. "Sorry we're late." Traffic was murder coming through Riverside. The transformation in Maria was immediate and visible. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, she smiled with genuine happiness. "Tank," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "You made good time." Rebecca Morrison found herself face to face with 5 individuals who radiated a kind of quiet competence that was completely foreign to her suburban experience. These weren't the stereotypical veterans she'd imagined based on media portrayals and her own prejudices. They looked like successful professionals, like people who'd accomplished significant things and commanded respect in their chosen fields. Doc approached Maria and Diego with the gentle demeanor that had made her such an effective combat medic. "Hey, Santos," she said softly. "This must be Diego. Your mama told us all about you, buddy. She's really proud of you." Diego looked up at the woman with the kind of wonder reserved for meeting real-life superheroes. His mama had told him stories about Doc, about how she'd saved soldiers' lives under enemy fire, about how she'd once performed surgery in the back of a moving vehicle to remove shrapnel from a wounded Marine. "Are you really Doc?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Guilty as charged," Doc replied with a grin. "Your mama and I served together in Afghanistan. She saved my life more than once by keeping our communications equipment running when everything else was falling apart." Wheels stepped forward next, his easy smile and relaxed demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension that had been building in the pickup area. "Diego, right? Your mom told me you're working on a bridge building project for school. I'd love to see your design sometime. I bet you inherited her engineering mind." Bear, despite his intimidating size, had the gentlest voice of the group. "Mrs. Santos," he said formally, offering Maria a slight nod of respect. "It's good to see you again. You look well." Phoenix completed the circle, her hard hat and work clothes marking her as someone who built things for a living. "Santos," she said with genuine warmth, "I've been looking forward to this reunion for months. Tank's been trying to get us all together since last Christmas." The parents who'd been watching the confrontation found themselves witnessing something completely outside their frame of reference. These weren't the damaged, dangerous veterans that Rebecca Morrison had described. They were accomplished professionals who clearly held Maria in high regard, who'd traveled hundreds of miles to support her, who spoke to her and Diego with obvious respect and affection. Ashley Kim's live stream was exploding with comments as viewers tried to process what they were seeing. The narrative she'd been crafting about Maria as a dangerous, unstable veteran was crumbling in real time, as her audience watched 5 clearly successful military professionals treat Maria like a beloved family member. Jennifer Walsh felt the first flutter of unease as she watched the easy camaraderie between Maria and her former unit. Her brothers had that same kind of bond with their military friends, the kind of loyalty that transcended civilian understanding. She began to suspect that Rebecca might have misjudged the situation badly. Caroline Drake was frantically Googling military terminology on her phone, trying to understand the significance of what she was witnessing. Words like platoon and deployment were being thrown around with the casual familiarity of shared experience, and she was beginning to realize that Maria's claims about military service might be more substantial than they'd assumed. Tank surveyed the assembled parents with the kind of tactical assessment he'd once used to evaluate potential threats in hostile territory. His gaze lingered on Rebecca Morrison, taking in her expensive clothes, her entitled posture, her obvious discomfort with being confronted by people she couldn't intimidate or dismiss. "So," Tank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I hear there's been some confusion about Sergeant Santos here. Some questions about her service record, her character, her fitness as a parent." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I thought we might clear that up." Rebecca found her voice, though it lacked the confident authority she'd wielded just minutes before. "And you are?" "Staff Sergeant James Williams, United States Army," Tank replied with crisp formality. "I was Sergeant Santos's platoon leader for 2 tours in Afghanistan. These are her squad mates: Corporal Martinez, our medic; Private First Class Chen, our communications specialist; Staff Sergeant Johnson, heavy weapons; and Specialist Taylor, combat engineer." The military titles and formal introductions had an immediate impact on the assembled parents. Several people who'd been recording the confrontation suddenly looked uncomfortable with their phones, realizing they'd been documenting something far more serious than suburban drama. Doc stepped forward, her medical training making her sensitive to the trauma that public humiliation could cause. "I understand there have been some concerns about Maria's mental health," she said, her voice professional but warm. "As someone who's worked with combat veterans for the past 5 years at the VA Medical Center in San Diego, I can tell you that Sergeant Santos is one of the most resilient, capable people I've ever known. She kept our entire platoon alive for 2 tours," Wheels added, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "When our communications equipment failed under enemy fire, Maria would have it running again in minutes. When our vehicles broke down in hostile territory, she'd get them moving with spare parts and ingenuity. She saved lives with her technical skills more times than any of us can count." Bear's deep voice rumbled with quiet intensity as he continued the testimonial. "The day Maria got hurt, she was trying to repair a communications array that would have allowed us to call in air support. She stayed at her post under enemy fire, trying to save the lives of soldiers she'd never met. She got burned pulling wounded men from a burning vehicle after an IED explosion. Phoenix concluded the impromptu character reference with the precision of an engineer presenting technical specifications. Maria Santos is one of the most honorable people I've ever served with. She's a decorated veteran, a skilled technician, and a woman who sacrificed her own safety for the lives of others. Any community would be lucky to have her as a neighbor and role model. The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca Morrison found herself face to face with testimony that completely contradicted everything she'd assumed about Maria. These weren't just character references. They were detailed accounts of heroism and sacrifice delivered by people whose own credentials were obviously impressive. Diego stood taller beside his mother, his chest swelling with pride as he listened to the adults describe his mama's service and sacrifice. He'd always known she was special, but hearing these stories from her fellow soldiers gave him a new understanding of just how remarkable she truly was. Maria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness or shame, but from the overwhelming gratitude of being seen and valued by the people who mattered most. For months, she'd carried the weight of Rebecca Morrison's judgment, allowing it to chip away at her sense of self-worth. But standing here, surrounded by her military family, she remembered who she'd been before the scars, before the nightmares, before the daily struggle to fit into a civilian world that didn't understand her value. Ashley Kim's live stream was now dominated by comments defending Maria and criticizing the parents who'd been mocking her. Viewers were sharing their own stories of military service, posting links to articles about veteran discrimination, and demanding accountability for the cruel treatment they'd witnessed. Tank wasn't finished. He'd spent years leading soldiers, and he understood the importance of establishing clear boundaries and consequences. Now, he continued, his voice taking on the edge that had once made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. I understand that some of you have been entertaining yourselves by mocking a decorated veteran and her son. I understand that you've been treating their presence at your school like some kind of threat to your children's safety. Rebecca opened her mouth to interrupt, but Tank's raised hand stopped her before she could speak. I'm not finished, he said with quiet authority. Sergeant Santos has been nothing but respectful in her interactions with this community. She's tried to blend in, to avoid conflict, to give her son a normal childhood. But apparently, some of you have mistaken her courtesy for weakness. Doc stepped forward to add her perspective. Maria has been dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of combat injuries for 2 years. She's undergone 16 surgeries, months of physical therapy, and ongoing treatment for trauma-related symptoms. Despite all of that, she's working 2 jobs to support her son, maintaining his honor roll status, and contributing positively to this community. The fact that anyone would mock her scars, question her mental health, or suggest she's unfit to be around children is not just cruel, Wheels continued, it's ignorant. Those scars represent sacrifice made on behalf of every person in this country, including everyone standing here today. Bear's massive frame seemed to fill the space as he spoke. We've all seen what real threats look like. We've faced actual dangers, actual violence, actual instability. Maria Santos represents none of those things. She represents service, sacrifice, and strength. Anyone who can't see that is revealing their own character, not hers. Phoenix brought her engineer's precision to the final point. We're not here to threaten anyone or cause trouble. We're here to support our sister and to make sure this community understands exactly who they've been mistreating. Maria Santos is a hero, and she deserves to be treated with the respect that designation commands. The transformation in the pickup area was complete. Parents who'd been silent observers were now looking ashamed of their complicity. Children who'd been playing nearby had stopped to listen to the adults talking about heroes and service. Even some of Rebecca's closest allies were beginning to distance themselves from her position. But Rebecca Morrison had built her social empire on never backing down, never admitting error, and never allowing her authority to be questioned. Instead of recognizing the legitimacy of what she was hearing, instead of acknowledging the magnitude of her mistake, she doubled down on her attack with the desperation of someone who felt her world crumbling around her. This is all very touching, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "But it doesn't change the facts. I don't care what she did overseas. Right now she's clearly struggling with mental health issues, she can't afford proper clothing, and she's raising her son in poverty. That's not the kind of influence I want around my children." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Maria Santos felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she'd accepted Rebecca's judgment, had allowed herself to believe that maybe she didn't belong in this suburban paradise, that maybe her scars and struggles really did make her unsuitable company for normal families. But surrounded by her platoon, reminded of who she'd been and what she'd accomplished, Maria Santos finally found her voice. Maria Santos looked at Rebecca Morrison with the steady gaze of someone who had faced down enemy fire and emerged stronger. The words that had once cut deep now seemed small and petty compared to the sacrifices she'd made and the battles she'd won. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. "Mrs. Morrison," Maria said, each word measured and deliberate, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I am struggling. I struggle every morning when I wake up from nightmares about watching my friends die. I struggle when my hands shake so badly from nerve damage that I can't button Diego's shirts. I struggle to make rent every month on a waitress salary and disability payments that barely cover our basic needs." The pickup area had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something momentous was happening, their usual chatter fading to nothing as they watched the adults with wide, curious eyes. Ashley Kim's live stream had attracted over 2,000 viewers, and the comments were coming in so fast they were just a blur of outrage and support. "But here's what you don't understand," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My struggles don't make me weak, they make me resilient. My scars don't make me dangerous. They make me someone who understands the real cost of safety and freedom. My financial situation doesn't make me unsuitable company for your children. It makes me someone who knows the value of hard work and sacrifice." Tank stood at Maria's right shoulder, his presence radiating protective energy without overshadowing her moment. Duck was positioned slightly behind, and to the left, her medical training making her hyper-aware of stress indicators in everyone present. Wheels, Bear, and Phoenix formed a loose semicircle that somehow managed to be both supportive and intimidating without saying a word. Diego pressed closer to his mother's side, his small hand finding hers and squeezing tight. At 9 years old, he was witnessing something that would shape his understanding of courage and dignity for the rest of his life. His mama wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for every person who'd ever been judged by circumstances beyond their control. "You want to talk about influences on children?" Maria asked, her voice taking on an edge that made several parents step back involuntarily. "Let's talk about the influence of teaching kids that it's acceptable to mock people for their appearance. Let's discuss the lesson children learn when they watch adults bully someone who can't fight back. Let's examine what you're really modeling when you treat poverty like a moral failing and trauma like a character flaw." Rebecca Morrison felt the foundation of her social authority cracking beneath her feet. She'd built her reputation on being the moral arbiter of Pinewood Elementary, the woman who decided who belonged and who didn't. But now she found herself facing someone whose moral authority came from sacrifice rather than social status, from service rather than entitlement. That's not..." Rebecca stammered, her usual eloquence deserting her in the face of Maria's quiet intensity. "That's not what?" Maria pressed, stepping forward for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "That's not what you've been doing for months? Mocking my appearance, questioning my fitness as a parent, treating my son like he's contaminated by association with me." Jennifer Walsh looked around desperately for support, but found that even her closest allies were avoiding eye contact. The social dynamics that had seemed so clear just minutes before had shifted completely, leaving her stranded on the wrong side of a moral divide she hadn't seen coming. Caroline Drake was frantically deleting comments from her social media posts, realizing too late that her participation in the harassment campaign was now permanently documented online. Screenshots were already circulating, and her employer's HR department was going to have some very pointed questions for her on Monday morning. Ashley Kim's live stream had become a liability rather than an asset. The comments were overwhelmingly critical of the parents who'd been mocking Maria, and several viewers had already identified Ashley by name and begun posting information about her employer and personal social media accounts. The viral fame she'd craved was turning into a nightmare of public accountability. Principal Robert Hayes had been alerted to the disturbance in the pickup area and was making his way across the parking lot with the measured pace of someone who'd dealt with parent conflicts before but had never encountered anything quite like this. He could see the crowd of adults gathered around someone, could hear raised voices, and could sense the tension that seemed to electrify the afternoon air. Mr. Thompson, Diego's teacher, had also noticed the commotion from his classroom window. He'd been worried about Diego's increasingly withdrawn behavior in recent weeks, and seeing the boy's mother surrounded by what appeared to be military personnel, he began to understand the source of the family's stress. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Maria continued, her voice carrying across the pickup area like a sermon delivered from moral high ground. "My son has watched me try to fit in, try to be invisible, try not to make waves. He's seen me accept your judgment and your cruelty without fighting back. What kind of lesson is that, teaching him about standing up for what's right?" Diego looked up at his mother with eyes shining with pride and something deeper, understanding. For months, he'd watched her shoulders slump whenever they came to school pickup. He'd seen the way she tried to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less threatening to people who seemed determined to find fault with her existence. "But today," Maria said, looking down at Diego with a smile that transformed her entire face, "today he gets to see something different. Today he gets to watch his mama remember who she really is." Tank stepped forward slightly, not to take over but to add weight to Maria's words. "Sergeant Santos led communications repair teams under enemy fire," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed heroism firsthand. "She's crawled into burning vehicles to save wounded soldiers. She's worked 20-hour shifts to keep life-saving equipment operational in one of the most dangerous places on Earth." "And you think," Doc added, her medical training lending clinical precision to her words, "that someone with that kind of courage and dedication is going to be intimidated by suburban bullies who've never faced anything more challenging than choosing the right wine for a dinner party?" The crowd of parents had grown as word of the confrontation spread. Some were recording with their phones. Others were simply watching in fascination as their carefully ordered social hierarchy collapsed in real time. A few parents who'd remained neutral in the ongoing harassment campaign were beginning to speak up in support of Maria. "I think this has gone far enough," said a woman named Patricia Hernandez, whose daughter was in Diego's class. "Maria has always been polite and respectful. I've never seen her do anything that would justify this kind of treatment." Another parent, David Kim, stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "My father served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "He came home with scars too, physical and mental. The way he was treated by people who should have thanked him for his service was one of the great shames of our generation. I won't be part of repeating that mistake." The tide of public opinion was turning visibly, and Rebecca Morrison could feel her social empire crumbling around her. Parents who'd supported her through their silence were now actively distancing themselves from her position. Her inner circle was dissolving as Jennifer and Caroline realized the social cost of their loyalty. Phoenix stepped forward with the practical mindset of an engineer who solved problems for a living. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to managing complex projects and difficult personalities. "Sergeant Santos is going to continue being an exemplary parent and community member, just like she always has been. Her son is going to continue excelling in school and growing up to be the kind of man who stands up for what's right. And all of you," Bear added, his massive frame lending weight to his words, "are going to remember that before you judge someone based on their appearance or circumstances, You might want to find out who they really are and what they've sacrificed for your freedom. Principal Hayes finally reached the edge of the crowd, his administrative instincts recognizing a situation that required delicate handling. He'd been briefed about the ongoing social tensions in the pickup area, but he hadn't realized the extent of the harassment or the credentials of the parent being targeted. "Is there a problem here?" Principal Hayes asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone responsible for maintaining order and protecting all members of his school community. Tank turned to address the principal with the respectful formality of someone who understood chain of command. "No problem, sir. Just some community members getting acquainted with Sergeant Santos here and learning about her military service and dedication to this school community." Principal Hayes looked at Maria with new recognition. He'd noticed Diego Santos's exceptional performance in school, his maturity and leadership qualities, his obvious respect for authority and concern for other students. Now he was beginning to understand the source of those admirable traits. "Sergeant Santos," Principal Hayes said with genuine respect, "I had no idea about your military background. Thank you for your service, and thank you for raising such an exceptional young man. Diego is one of our most outstanding students." The public acknowledgement from the school's principal sent another shockwave through the assembled parents. Those who'd remained neutral were now openly supportive, while Rebecca's remaining allies found themselves increasingly isolated. Mr. Thompson had made his way through the crowd and now stood near Diego, his teacher's instincts making him protective of his students' well-being. "Diego," he said warmly, "I hope you know how proud you should be of your mother. The essay you wrote about heroes makes a lot more sense now." Diego looked up at his teacher with tears of pride in his eyes. "She really is a hero, isn't she, Mr. Thompson?" "She absolutely is," Mr. Thompson replied, looking directly at Maria. "And so are you, for standing up for her the way you did." Ashley Kim's live stream had become a public relations disaster. Viewers were screenshot her previous posts mocking Maria, sharing them across social media platforms with commentary about bullying and veteran discrimination. Her employer had already been tagged in multiple posts, and she realized with growing horror that her moment of viral fame was becoming a career-ending scandal. Rebecca Morrison found herself standing almost alone, her support network having evaporated as the social cost of association with her position became clear. Jennifer Walsh had quietly slipped away during the principal's arrival, and Caroline Drake was pretending to be engrossed in her phone while actually Googling crisis management strategies. "Mrs. Morrison," Maria said, her voice now carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd reclaimed her power, "I want you to understand something. I didn't ask for this confrontation. I didn't want to make a scene or cause trouble. I just wanted to pick up my son from school without being treated like a threat to your community." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but Maria wasn't finished. "But I'm glad it happened," Maria continued, looking around at the assembled crowd of parents and children. "Because now Diego gets to see that standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or cruel or vindictive. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let others diminish it." Tank nodded approvingly. "That's the Sergeant Santos we served with," he said with pride. Calm under pressure, focused on what matters, always thinking about how to protect the people counting on her. Doc looked at the crowd of parents with the clinical assessment of someone trained to diagnose problems and prescribe solutions. "Maria doesn't need your approval or acceptance," she said firmly. "She's got a family that spans the globe, brothers and sisters who've shared foxholes and life-and-death decisions. But this community would be a lot better off if they recognized the treasure they've been treating like trash." Wheels stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned to find solutions under impossible circumstances. "Here's what I suggest," he said, addressing the crowd like a problem-solving session. "Maybe it's time for this community to examine how it treats people who are different, people who've sacrificed, people who don't fit the usual suburban mold." Phoenix concluded with the systematic thinking of an engineer who built things to last. Change starts with individual choices. Choose kindness over cruelty. Choose understanding over judgment. choose to learn someone's story before deciding their worth. The crowd began to disperse naturally, parents leading their children toward cars with thoughtful expressions and hushed conversations. Many stopped to speak with Maria, offering apologies, expressing gratitude for her service, or simply acknowledging that they'd learned something important. Patricia Hernandez approached with her daughter Sofia, who was Diego's classmate. "Maria, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. Sofia has told me so many wonderful things about Diego, and now I understand where he gets his character." David Kim brought his son over to meet Diego, explaining quietly that he wanted his boy to understand what real heroism looked like. Other parents followed suit, and soon Maria found herself surrounded by genuine community support rather than hostile judgment. Rebecca Morrison stood alone beside her BMW, watching her social kingdom collapse around her. A few parents approached her with expressions of disappointment or anger, making it clear that her actions had consequences beyond just social embarrassment. Ashley Kim had ended her live stream and was frantically trying to manage the fallout from her viral documentation of veteran harassment. Her phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, and none of them were positive. As the crowd thinned and normal pickup routines resumed, Tank gathered his team around Maria and Diego. "So," he said with the grin that had sustained their unit through impossible deployments, "what do you say we grab some dinner and catch up properly?" Maria looked at her son, at her military family, at the parents who'd found the courage to support her, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for herself, but for Diego's future in this community that was finally seeing them clearly. "I'd like that," Maria said, her voice strong and clear. "Diego, what do you think? Want to hear some stories about your mama's adventures?" Diego nodded enthusiastically, his earlier distress transformed into excitement at the prospect of learning more about his mother's heroic past and spending time with the legendary figures from her stories. As they walked toward the parking lot, Maria's military family surrounding her and Diego like a protective formation, she realized that she'd finally stopped trying to be invisible. She'd remembered who she was, and more importantly, she'd shown her son that dignity wasn't something others could grant or take away. It was something you claimed for yourself and defended when necessary. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Pinewood Elementary, casting long shadows across the pickup area that had been transformed from a place of humiliation into a setting for reclaimed pride. Maria Santos walked taller than she had in months, her son's hand in hers, surrounded by people who understood her worth and wouldn't let the world forget it. The battle was over, but the victory would last a lifetime. Diego had learned that heroes don't always wear capes or carry weapons. Sometimes they wear thrift store clothes and carry the scars of service. Sometimes they work double shifts and struggle to make rent while teaching their children about honor and resilience. And sometimes, when the world tries to make them invisible, they remember who they are and refuse to disappear. Principal Hayes made a mental note to review the school's policies on harassment and discrimination, realizing that his institution had failed to protect one of its most deserving families. Changes would be made, training would be implemented, and the culture of exclusion that had allowed this situation to develop would be systematically dismantled. Mr. Thompson was already planning lessons about heroism and service, inspired by watching one of his students defend his mother with a kind of courage that couldn't be taught from textbooks. Diego Santos would be invited to share his mother's story with the class, helping other children understand that heroes come in many forms. The ripple effects would continue for weeks and months to come. Parents would have difficult conversations with their children about judgment and kindness. Social media posts would be deleted, and apologies would be issued. A community would be forced to examine its values and make changes that honored the sacrifice of those who'd served. But for now, in this moment, Maria Santos was simply a mother, walking toward dinner with her son and the family that distance and time could never diminish. She was no longer hiding from her past or apologizing for her present. She was exactly who she'd always been: a warrior, a protector, a woman who'd given everything for others and finally learned to value herself. The pickup line at Pinewood Elementary would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Pinewood Elementary, and the changes rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. Maria Santos no longer arrived at school pickup 15 minutes early to claim her spot by the fence. Instead, she walked confidently into the main pickup area, exchanging warm greetings with parents who now knew her name and her story. Diego bounded out of school each afternoon to find his mother surrounded by genuine friends rather than hostile strangers. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few days after Tank and her platoon's intervention had been awkward, filled with stilted conversations and careful politeness from parents who were still processing what they'd witnessed. But gradually, authenticity replaced artificial courtesy. Patricia Hernandez had invited Maria and Diego for dinner the following weekend, beginning a friendship that would become one of the strongest bonds either woman had ever formed. David Kim had asked Maria to speak to his son's Boy Scout troop about military service, leading to a monthly volunteer position that brought her immense satisfaction. Rebecca Morrison had disappeared from the social landscape of Pinewood Elementary, as completely as if she'd never existed. Her family had quietly transferred Madison to a private school across town, citing, quote, philosophical differences with the current administration. The WhatsApp group she'd once ruled with an iron fist had dissolved entirely, replaced by a new parent communication system focused on supporting all families rather than excluding those deemed unworthy. Jennifer Walsh had attempted to salvage her reputation through a series of increasingly desperate social media posts about supporting veterans, but the damage to her credibility was irreparable. Her real estate business had suffered as clients learned about her role in the harassment campaign, and she'd been forced to take a position with a different agency in another city. Caroline Drake had issued a public apology through the school newsletter, acknowledging her participation in what she now recognized as systematic bullying. She'd begun volunteering with a local veterans support organization, though Maria suspected the motivation was more about image rehabilitation than genuine remorse. Ashley Kim's social media empire had crumbled spectacularly. The viral fame she'd craved had indeed materialized, but as the villain rather than the hero of her own story. Screenshots of her posts mocking Maria had been shared millions of times across platforms, accompanied by commentary about cyberbullying and veteran discrimination. She'd lost her marketing job when her employer realized the liability of having someone associated with harassment campaigns representing their brand. The last Maria had heard, Ashley was working at a coffee shop in another state, having learned the hard way that viral fame was a double-edged sword. Principal Hayes had implemented comprehensive changes throughout the school system. A new anti-harassment policy specifically addressed discrimination based on military status, economic circumstances, and disability. Mandatory sensitivity training had been instituted for all staff, with particular emphasis on recognizing and supporting military families. A Veterans Day assembly had been planned for November, with Maria serving as the keynote speaker. Mr. Thompson had become one of Diego's greatest advocates, recognizing the boy's unique combination of maturity, empathy, and leadership potential. He'd recommended Diego for the school's peer mediation program, where the 9-year-old's ability to help other children resolve conflicts had made him something of a legend among both students and faculty. But perhaps the most significant change had occurred within Maria herself. The confidence that her military family had helped her reclaim had taken root and flourished. She'd begun attending therapy sessions at the VA Medical Center with renewed commitment, working through trauma she'd buried for years. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd lost their power to define her days. Her job at Sunrise Diner had evolved as well. Pete, her manager, had been so impressed by the stories of her military service that he'd offered her a promotion to assistant manager. The additional responsibility and salary increase had allowed Maria to move from the cramped apartment in Valley Vista to a small house with a yard where Diego could play and friends could visit. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside, a modest 2-bedroom ranch that needed paint and had a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. But it was theirs, and Maria had thrown herself into making it a home, with the same methodical determination she'd once applied to repairing communications equipment under enemy fire. Diego had his own room for the first time in his life, painted bright blue with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that Tank had helped install during a weekend visit. The backyard had become Maria's sanctuary, a place where she could work with her hands and find peace in the simple act of growing things. She'd planted a vegetable garden that was already producing tomatoes and peppers, and she'd started a flower bed that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. On difficult days, when the memories pressed too close and the world felt overwhelming, she could step outside and remember that beauty could grow from careful tending and patient nurturing. Diego had thrived in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. His grades had improved from excellent to extraordinary, and his teachers regularly commented on his emotional intelligence and natural leadership abilities. He'd been elected to the student council as a fourth-grade representative, the youngest student ever to hold the position. His platform had been simple but powerful. Everyone deserves respect, everyone has value, and everyone should feel safe at school. The friendships he'd formed were deep and genuine, built on the foundation of authenticity his mother had finally learned to embrace. Sofia Hernandez had become his closest friend, and their families spent weekend afternoons together, sharing meals and stories that wove their lives together in meaningful ways. Diego had also befriended Marcus Kim, David's son, and the boys had formed a club they called the Respect Squad, dedicated to making sure no child at Pinewood Elementary ever felt excluded or bullied. Tank and the rest of Maria's military family had become regular visitors, their presence a constant reminder that love and loyalty transcended geography and time. Doc made the drive from San Diego once a month, usually timing her visits to coincide with Diego's medical checkups so she could provide professional insight into his care. Wheels had helped Maria set up a computer in Diego's room, complete with educational software that was already accelerating the boy's learning in mathematics and science. Bear had become Diego's unofficial uncle, teaching the boy about responsibility and respect through weekend camping trips that were equal parts adventure and life lessons. Phoenix had begun mentoring Diego in engineering concepts, using simple projects to introduce complex principles that sparked the boy's natural curiosity about how things worked. The relationships had enriched Maria's life in ways she hadn't anticipated. For years, she'd carried the weight of single parenthood as a burden that isolated her from others. But watching Diego form bonds with her military family, seeing him learn from their experiences and wisdom, she realized that family could be chosen as well as inherited. The local veterans community had embraced Maria as well. Word of her story had spread through informal networks, and she'd begun receiving invitations to speak at American Legion meetings and VFW gatherings. Her message was always the same. Veterans' worth wasn't determined by their visible scars or current circumstances, but by their service and their ongoing contributions to their communities. These speaking engagements had led to unexpected opportunities. A local nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military families had offered Maria a position as a community outreach coordinator. The job combined her technical skills with her lived experience as a veteran parent, and it provided both meaningful work and financial stability that allowed her to plan for Diego's future with confidence rather than anxiety. The work involved connecting military families with resources, advocating for policy changes that supported veteran reintegration, and providing peer counseling to women veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. Maria discovered that her own experiences, including the harassment she'd endured at Pinewood Elementary, resonated with other veterans who'd faced similar discrimination and judgment. One case that particularly moved her involved a young veteran named Sarah Mitchell, a former Air Force mechanic who'd lost her leg to an IED in Syria. Sarah was facing harassment at her daughter's daycare center, where other parents had complained about her prosthetic limb being scary for their children. Maria had been able to connect Sarah with legal resources, advocacy groups, and most importantly, a community of people who understood that visible disabilities were not character flaws. Another veteran, Marcus Rodriguez, had been struggling with employment discrimination despite his exemplary military record and relevant civilian qualifications. Employers seemed supportive during initial interviews, but offers would mysteriously disappear when they learned about his PTSD diagnosis. Maria had helped him connect with veteran-friendly employers and advocacy organizations that could address the illegal discrimination he was experiencing. These connections reminded Maria daily that her confrontation at Pinewood Elementary had been about more than just her personal dignity. It had been about challenging a culture that too often treated veterans as problems to be managed rather than assets to be valued. Her willingness to stand up for herself had ripple effects that extended far beyond her own family's well-being. Diego had become increasingly aware of his mother's work and its importance. He'd begun volunteering at the Veterans Organization during school breaks, helping with filing and data entry tasks that were appropriate for his age. But more significantly, he'd absorbed the lesson that using your voice to help others was both a privilege and a responsibility. His essay for the school's Veterans Day Assembly had brought tears to the eyes of every adult who read it. "My mom is a hero not because she was in the Army," he'd written, "but because she never stopped fighting for what's right. She fought for our country overseas, and now she fights for veterans at home. She taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are scared." The essay had been selected for publication in the school district's newsletter, and copies had been shared throughout the local veterans community. Several organizations had reached out to invite Diego to read his essay at their Veterans Day events, making him perhaps the youngest keynote speaker in their history. Maria's relationship with her own recovery had evolved as well. The therapy sessions that had once felt like admissions of weakness now felt like acts of strength. She'd learned to recognize the triggers that could send her spiraling into anxiety or depression, and, more importantly, she'd developed strategies for managing those triggers when they couldn't be avoided. The panic attacks that had once left her gasping for breath in grocery store aisles had become manageable episodes that she could navigate with breathing techniques and grounding exercises. The nightmares that had once stolen her sleep for weeks at a time now occurred less frequently and with less intensity. She'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending trauma hadn't occurred, but about integrating those experiences in ways that allowed growth rather than stagnation. One particular breakthrough had come during a therapy session focused on guilt and responsibility. For years, Maria had carried the weight of Rodriguez and Kim's deaths, believing that if she'd been faster or better or more skillful, she might have saved them. Her therapist had helped her understand that survival wasn't about deserving or earning, and that honoring her fallen comrades meant living fully rather than punishing herself for being alive. This understanding had freed Maria to pursue opportunities she'd previously avoided. She'd begun taking evening classes in computer programming, building on the technical skills she'd developed in the military. The goal was to eventually transition into a higher-paying civilian career that would provide even greater stability for Diego's future. She'd also started dating for the first time since Diego's birth, though tentatively, and with careful consideration for her son's emotional needs. The relationship with James Mitchell, a fellow veteran she'd met through her outreach work, was progressing slowly but steadily. James was a former Marine who'd lost his left arm in Fallujah and now worked as a counselor for at-risk youth. He understood the challenges of veteran reintegration and single parenthood in ways that civilian partners might struggle to comprehend. Diego had initially been protective and suspicious of any man who showed interest in his mother, but James had won him over through patience, respect, and genuine interest in the boy's thoughts and feelings. Their relationship had developed naturally, built on shared interests in science and engineering rather than forced bonding activities. The three of them had begun spending weekend afternoons working on projects together, building model rockets, constructing elaborate Lego cities, teaching Diego basic automotive maintenance. These activities provided Diego with positive male role models while allowing Maria to explore her feelings without pressure or expectations. But perhaps the most profound change had been in Maria's relationship with her own story. For years, she'd tried to minimize her military service, to downplay her sacrifices, to make herself smaller and less threatening to civilian sensibilities. The confrontation at Pinewood Elementary had forced her to reclaim her narrative, to own her experiences, and to understand that her service was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. She'd begun keeping a journal, writing down memories of her military service that she wanted to preserve for Diego's understanding. Some entries focused on the technical challenges she'd overcome, the equipment she'd repaired under impossible conditions, the solutions she'd crafted from spare parts and determination. Others explored the relationships she'd formed with her fellow soldiers, the bonds that had sustained them through deployments and danger. But she also wrote about the difficulty of coming home, the challenges of translating military skills into civilian opportunities, the isolation that came from being surrounded by people who'd never faced life and death decisions. These entries weren't complaints or requests for pity, but honest documentation of experiences that too many veterans shared, but rarely discussed openly. The journal had become a gift for Diego's future, a way for him to understand not just what his mother had done, but why it mattered, and how it had shaped the person she'd become. She wrote about the values that military service had instilled: integrity, loyalty, personal courage, selfless service, and how those values could be applied in civilian life. On the 6-month anniversary of the school pickup confrontation, Maria had received an unexpected letter. It was from Rebecca Morrison, postmarked from the private school where her daughter now attended. The letter was carefully worded, obviously drafted with legal consultation, but it contained what appeared to be a genuine apology. "Dear Miss Santos," the letter began, "I have had considerable time to reflect on my behavior during our interactions at Pinewood Elementary. I realize now that my actions were not only inappropriate, but actively harmful to you and your son. My judgment was clouded by prejudices and assumptions that I am deeply ashamed of. While I understand that an apology cannot undo the pain I caused, I want you to know that your courage in standing up to me has led to significant personal reflection and growth. I am working with a therapist to understand the sources of my behavior and to ensure it never happens again. I hope that your family has found the peace and respect you deserve." Maria had read the letter several times, trying to determine its sincerity. Ultimately, she'd decided that Rebecca's motivations mattered less than the acknowledgement of harm and the commitment to change. She'd written a brief response, accepting the apology and expressing hope that Rebecca's growth would benefit other families in the future. The letter had been shared with Diego, who'd listened to his mother read it with the serious attention he gave to all important matters. "Do you think she means it, Mama?" he'd asked. "I think she's trying to mean it," Maria had replied, "and sometimes trying is the first step toward actually changing." The Veterans Day Assembly at Pinewood Elementary had been a transformative event for the entire school community. Maria's keynote address had focused not on the glory of military service, but on the responsibility that came with freedom and the importance of supporting those who'd sacrificed to preserve it. She'd spoken about the diversity of military service, emphasizing that veterans came from all backgrounds, all economic levels, all walks of life. She'd addressed the visible and invisible wounds that many veterans carried, explaining that understanding and support were more valuable than pity or charity. But perhaps most importantly, she'd talked about the strength that could come from surviving difficult experiences. "Trauma isn't something that happens to weak people," she'd explained to the assembled students, parents, and faculty. "It's something that happens to human beings. What makes us strong isn't avoiding difficult experiences, but learning from them and using them to help others." Diego had introduced his mother with the kind of pride that made every adult in the auditorium tear up. "My mama taught me that heroes aren't people who never get scared," he'd said into the microphone with remarkable composure for a 9-year-old. "Heroes are people who do brave things even when they are scared. My mama is the bravest person I know, and I'm proud to be her son." The standing ovation that followed had lasted nearly 5 minutes, and Maria had struggled to maintain her composure as she looked out at a sea of faces that now reflected respect and admiration, rather than judgment and hostility. After the assembly, dozens of families had approached Maria to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. Single parents dealing with economic hardship, families coping with disability, immigrants facing discrimination, elderly relatives managing the challenges of aging, all had found inspiration in Maria's journey from victimization to empowerment. The connections formed that day had strengthened the entire school community. Parents who'd previously had little interaction began organizing support networks for families facing various challenges. A monthly potluck dinner had been established, where families could gather and share resources, advice, and friendship across the boundaries that had once divided them. As the school year drew to a close, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from the margins of the Pinewood Elementary community to its very heart. The changes in her external circumstances were significant: better job, nicer home, financial stability, social connections. But the internal transformation was even more profound. She'd reclaimed her identity as someone whose experiences had value, whose perspective mattered, whose presence enriched rather than threatened the communities she joined. She'd learned to see her scars not as marks of damage, but as evidence of survival, not as sources of shame, but as symbols of strength. Diego's growth had been equally remarkable. The shy, defensive boy who'd felt compelled to protect his mother from cruel strangers had evolved into a confident young leader who used his voice to advocate for justice and inclusion. His teachers predicted that he would continue to excel academically, but more importantly, they saw in him the qualities of character that would serve him well, regardless of his chosen career path. The last day of fourth grade had been bittersweet. Diego would be moving on to middle school in the fall, beginning a new chapter of his educational journey. But the foundation built during his time at Pinewood Elementary, the friendships formed, the lessons learned, the confidence gained, would support him through whatever challenges lay ahead. As Maria watched Diego clean out his desk and say goodbye to Mr. Thompson, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the series of events that had initially seemed so devastating. The confrontation with Rebecca Morrison had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had forced Maria to choose between continuing to hide or finally standing up for herself and her son. That choice had changed everything, not just for her family, but for the entire community that had witnessed the power of courage, the importance of truth, and the possibility of redemption that came when people were willing to examine their own biases and grow beyond them. The summer ahead would bring new adventures and opportunities. Tank and the Platoon were planning a reunion camping trip that would give Diego his first taste of military culture and camaraderie. Maria's relationship with James was progressing toward discussions of a more permanent future together. The Veterans Organization had offered her a promotion that would allow her to expand her outreach work statewide. But as they drove home from Diego's last day of fourth grade, windows down and music playing, Maria felt a deep sense of contentment with the present moment. She'd learned that happiness wasn't about having a perfect life, but about fully embracing the life you had. She discovered that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time you did. Diego chattered excitedly about summer plans and middle school preparations, his voice filled with the optimism and confidence that had been hard-won but were now unshakable. In the rearview mirror, Pinewood Elementary grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, but the lessons learned there would last a lifetime. Maria Santos was no longer the broken veteran hiding in the shadows, hoping to remain invisible until she could find a way to fit in. She was a decorated soldier, a devoted mother, a valued community member, and a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons but with truth, dignity, and the courage to demand the respect that every human being deserved. The road ahead was bright with possibility, and for the first time in years, Maria was eager to see where it would lead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.